The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves across Samuel Crawford's weathered face as he stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the sun bleed orange across the Montana sky. 3 years had passed since Martha's fever took her, leaving him alone on 200 acres of stubborn earth that seemed to grow nothing but memories and regret. At 42, Samuel's hands bore the calluses of a man who'd carved a life from wilderness, but his heart carried the deeper scars of love lost too soon. The other settlers whispered that grief had made him strange, a hermit who spoke more to his horses than to people, who worked his fields from dawn to dusk as if exhaustion could somehow fill the hollow spaces Martha had left behind. That morning started like any other, with coffee black as midnight and silence thick as winter wool. Samuel was mending fence when he first heard the growling, low and menacing, coming from the pine thicket near Bear Creek. He grabbed his rifle and moved carefully through the underbrush, expecting to find a wounded bear or a pack of coyotes. Fighting over a kill, what he found instead changed everything. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, crouched naked and snarling over the carcass of a deer. Her long black hair hung wild and matted around a face that would have been beautiful if not for the feral intensity in her dark eyes. She was thin but muscled, her body scarred by countless nights in the wilderness. When she saw Samuel, she bared her teeth like a cornered wolf, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Beneath the wildness, beneath the fear and fury, he saw something achingly human, a loneliness that matched his own. "Easy there," he whispered, lowering his rifle. "I won't hurt you." She tilted her head at the sound of his voice, confusion flickering across her features. When he took a step closer, she bolted into the trees with the fluid grace of something born to run wild. Samuel stood there long after she'd vanished, his heart hammering against his ribs. In 30 seconds, she'd shattered the careful numbness he'd built around himself. For the first time since Martha's death, he felt truly alive. He began leaving food at the edge of the thicket, bread, dried meat, whatever he could spare. Each morning, the offerings were gone, but he never saw her take them. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement in the trees, a flash of dark hair or the glint of watching eyes. Odd. But she remained as elusive as smoke. Weeks passed. The first snows began to fall, and Samuel's worry grew sharp as winter hunger. On a particularly bitter morning, he found her collapsed by the creek, her lips blue with cold, her body shaking with fever. This time she didn't run. Samuel carried her to his cabin, like she weighed nothing at all, her head lolling against his shoulder. As he laid her in Martha's old bed, guilt twisted in his chest. It felt like betrayal to bring another woman into the space his wife had occupied. But when the girl's eyes fluttered open and fixed on his face with desperate trust, his reservations crumbled. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She stared at him with those haunting dark eyes, but no words came. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had left her alone in the wilderness, stolen her voice along with her past. Samuel called her Luna, for the way she'd watched the moon through the cabin windows with an expression of profound longing. Over the following weeks, as her body healed, he began to understand the depth of her wildness. She flinched at sudden movements, couldn't bear to be enclosed in small spaces, and slept curled on the floor, despite his efforts to make her comfortable in the bed. But slowly, so slowly, she began to trust him. The first breakthrough came when she watched him splitting wood behind the cabin. Something in the rhythm seemed to calm her, and she crept closer until she was sitting just a few feet away. When he offered her the smaller axe, she took it with reverence, as if he'd handed her something sacred. She was surprisingly strong, her movements efficient and sure. As chips of wood flew, Samuel caught glimpses of intelligence in her eyes, a mind that had adapted and survived in ways he could barely imagine. "You weren't always wild, were you?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Luna paused mid-swing and looked at him with such profound sadness that his chest tightened. For just a moment, he saw past the feral exterior to the broken girl beneath, someone who had lost everything and found a way to endure by forgetting how to be human. Winter deepened, and with it, something unexpected began to bloom between them. Luna learned to help with the daily tasks, her movements becoming less frantic, more purposeful. She seemed to understand that Samuel meant no harm, that his quiet presence was a shelter from whatever storms had driven her into the wilderness. In the evenings, they sat by the fire in comfortable silence. Samuel would read aloud from Martha's old books, and though Luna gave no sign of understanding, she would listen with intense focus, as if his voice were a lifeline anchoring her to humanity. One night, as snow howled against the windows, Luna began to make sounds, not words, but soft vocalizations that reminded Samuel of wolf songs carried on the wind. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with such loneliness that tears pricked his eyes. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. That touch awakened something in Samuel that he'd thought died with Martha. Guilt crashed over him like a cold wave. How could he feel this way about another woman? How could he betray his wife's memory by letting his heart open to this strange, wounded creature who'd wandered out of the wilderness? But Luna's presence filled spaces in his soul he'd forgotten existed. Her gradual transformation from wild thing to something approaching human was like watching a miracle unfold day by day. And when she looked at him with those dark eyes, he saw not just trust, but something deeper, a recognition that perhaps they were two broken pieces that might fit together. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and returning life. Luna grew restless, often standing at the cabin door and staring toward the mountains with an expression of profound conflict. Samuel knew she felt the call of the wild, the pull of the only life she remembered. Clearly, he also knew he was falling in love with her. The realization hit him one morning as he watched her tend to his injured mare with gentle efficiency. She'd braided wildflowers into her knock-lean hair, and sunlight caught the planes of her face, revealing a beauty that took his breath away. But it was more than her looks, it was the fierce compassion in her touch, the way she seemed to understand the horse's pain and fear. "You've got healing hands," he said softly. Luna looked up at him, and for the first time, her lips curved in something that might have been a smile. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Luna spoke her first word, Samuel. His name on her lips was like a prayer, soft and wondering. When he turned to look at her, tears were streaming down her face. "You remember?" he whispered. She nodded slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice was rusty from disuse, but heartbreakingly beautiful. "I remember ... everything." The story that emerged over the following days was one of unspeakable tragedy. Luna's real name was Elena Morales. She'd been the daughter of a Mexican rancher, promised in marriage to a wealthy merchant's son. But she'd been in love with someone else, a young cowboy named Diego, who worked her father's land. On the night before her wedding, she and Diego had planned to run away together. They'd met at the old mission outside town, intending to ride north to Montana where they could start fresh. But Elena's father had discovered their plan. He'd arrived with armed men just as they were about to leave. "He shot Diego first," Elena whispered, her voice breaking, "right in front of me. Then he said, I'd brought shame on our family, that I was dead to him. His men were going to. They were going to kill me too." She'd escaped into the wilderness, wounded and grief-stricken. For months she'd wandered, slowly losing her grip on humanity as survival became her only focus. A pack of wolves had found her near death and, in some miracle of nature, accepted her. She'd lived with them for 2 years, forgetting human speech, forgetting everything except the pain of losing Diego and the will to survive. "I thought love was death," she said, looking at Samuel with eyes full of wonder. "But you ... you brought me back to life." Samuel felt his own eyes fill with tears. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, her body fitting against his like it was meant to be there. "Elena," he murmured against her hair. But their moment of peace was shattered by the thunder of approaching horses. Samuel released Elena and stepped protectively in front of her as 6 riders emerged from the tree line. They were hard-looking men, armed and travel-worn. Led by a figure Samuel recognized with a sinking heart, Don Carlos Morales, Elena's father. The older man's face was a mask of cold fury as his eyes found his daughter. Even after all this time, even wild and changed as she was, he knew her. "So, the wolf girl is human after all," Don Carlos said, his voice dripping contempt. "Should have known she'd find another man to corrupt with her shameful ways." Alina stepped out from behind Samuel, her chin raised defiantly. "I am not your daughter anymore? Father? You made that clear when you chose to murder the man I loved." Don Carlos's hand moved to his pistol. "You will return with me and fulfill your duty to our family. The Hernandez family still wishes the marriage to proceed." "Despite your wandering," Neverlina said firmly. Samuel had heard enough. He'd lost one woman to forces beyond his control. He wouldn't lose another to a man's misguided pride. "The lady's made her choice," he said, his own hand moving to his gun. "I suggest you respect it." Don Carlos laughed harshly. "Who are you, gringo, to interfere in family matters? This creature is my property." "She's not property," Samuel replied, his voice deadly quiet. "She's a woman with the right to choose her own path." The tension stretched taut as piano wire. 6 guns. Against one odds that would have intimidated most men. But Samuel had something worth dying for again, and that made him more dangerous than any of them. Alina stepped forward, placing herself between the two groups of armed men. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present. "Father, you taught me that family means protecting those you love, not controlling them. You broke that sacred trust when you murdered Diego. I forgive you for that, but I will never forget it." She turned to face her father fully, and Samuel saw the woman she'd become: strong, fierce, unbroken, despite everything that had been done. "To her, I choose love," she continued. "I choose the man who found me when I was lost and helped me remember how to be human. I choose Samuel Crawford, and I choose this life we're building together." Don Carlos's face twisted with rage, but before he could draw his weapon, Alina did something unexpected. She began to sing the same haunting melody Samuel had heard by the firelight.
Ow.
But now with words in Spanish that spoke of love and loss and hope reborn. The song seemed to drain the fight out of everyone present. Even Don Carlos's men lowered their weapons, touched by something in her voice that transcended anger and pride. When the last note faded, Lena's father sat silent in his saddle, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Mia," he whispered, "my little girl." "I was your little girl," Alina replied gently. "But that girl died the night you killed Diego. I am someone new. No, someone who has learned that love isn't possession, it's freedom." For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other across years of pain and misunderstanding. Finally, Don Carlos nodded slowly. "Perhaps I was wrong," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Perhaps I let pride and tradition blind me to what truly mattered." He turned his horse around, then paused and looked back at Samuel. "You protect her," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a father's blessing and a broken man's plea. "Protect her better than I did." Samuel nodded solemnly. "With my life?" As the riders disappeared into the distance, Alina collapsed into Samuel's arms, her body shaking with relief and exhaustion. But when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright. With joy. "Is this real?" she whispered. "Are we really free?" Instead of answering with words, Samuel cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her with all the love and longing he'd kept locked away since Martha's death. Alina kissed him back with equal fervor, and in that moment, the last walls around his heart crumbled completely. They were married the following spring in a simple ceremony by the creek where Samuel had first found her. The same preacher who'd buried Martha blessed their union. And though some of the other settlers whispered about the strange circumstances of their courtship, Samuel didn't care. He'd found love twice in one lifetime, more than most men could. Hope for Alina bloomed in their shared happiness like a wildflower finally given proper soil and sunlight. She learned to read from Martha's books, tended a garden that flourished under her gentle care, and slowly became the heart of their small community. Her past as the wolf girl became just another thread in the rich tapestry of frontier life, where everyone carried their own secrets and sorrows. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. Alina would sometimes sing her wolf songs, but now they carried notes of joy rather than loneliness. And Samuel would hold her close, marveling at the journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one evening as summer painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Giving up your father's world for this simple life." Lena smiled and placed her hand over her growing belly where their first child was. "Beginning to show I didn't give up a world," she said softly. "I found one. I found home." Samuel kissed her temple and pulled her closer, feeling the baby kick against his palm. In the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the rising moon, and Alina lifted her voice to answer not with the desperate loneliness of her wild years, but with the joy of a woman who had finally found where she belonged. The sound carried across the valley like a blessing, a promise that love could survive even the harshest wilderness, that broken hearts could heal, and that sometimes the very thing that nearly destroys us becomes the path to our salvation. Under the endless Montana sky, Samuel Crawford and Alina Morales had found their way home to each other, and their love story became legend whispered around campfires and told in saloons, a reminder that even in the hard country of the American frontier, miracles could still happen to those brave enough to believe in second chances. Years later, when travelers would pass through their valley and see the prosperous ranch with its laughing children and thriving livestock, they'd hear the story of the farmer who saved a girl raised by wolves and the wild woman who taught a grieving man to love again. But those who knew them best understood the deeper truth that they had saved each other, finding in their unlikely union a love that was both tender and fierce, civilized and wild, as enduring as the mountains themselves. And on clear nights, when the moon was full, if you listened carefully, you could still hear Elena's song drifting across the valley, no longer a howl of loneliness, but a hymn of gratitude for the love that had transformed them both from broken souls into something beautiful and whole.